Black woman asked, "Can I sell you some candy, sir?" The millionaire replied, "You're going to live with me." "And that?" "Get out of here immediately before I call security," shouted Margaret Whitfield, wife of billionaire Richard Whitfield, pointing her finger at the young black woman standing at the gate of the mansion. "People like you don't belong in this neighborhood." The torrential September rain had turned the elegant streets of Beverly Hills into chaos, but 26-year-old Diana Santos stood firm in the storm, holding her tray of homemade cupcakes with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the hysteria of the wealthy woman in front of her. "Ma'am, I just want to sell some cupcakes to buy medicine for my daughter," Diana said calmly, water streaming down his face, but his eyes revealing an inner strength that Margaret couldn't comprehend. Richard Whitfield watched the scene from a second-floor window, watching his wife publicly humiliate a desperate mother who had lost her job as a nurse 3 weeks earlier when a hospital discovered that she had reported irregularities in the medication of poor patients. Margaret continued to scream, filming Diana with her cell phone. "I'm going to post this in all the neighborhood groups. I'll make sure no one in this neighborhood buys anything from his." Diana never imagined that moment of public humiliation would become the catalyst for such an elaborate revenge that would completely destroy the Whitfield family's reputation. Because what Margaret didn't know was that Diana Santos wasn't just a desperate candy salesman. She was a Harvard-trained nurse specializing in hospital auditing, and she had spent the last 2 years meticulously documenting a medical fraud scheme that connected private hospitals to corrupt insurance companies. A scheme that had Richard Whitfield as its main investor. When Richard came down to intervene, he found Diana still standing at the gate, soaked to the bone, but with a smile that didn't match her seemingly desperate situation. "I'm sorry for my wife's behavior," he said, offering her a towel. "Please come in. Let's settle this civilly." Diana accepted the invitation, but not out of desperation. At that moment, as she crossed the marble hall of the Whitfield mansion, she knew she was entering the lair of the very beast that had destroyed her career. 3 years of silent investigation had led Diana there. Every forged document, every patient harmed, every death that could have been prevented, everything pointed to Richard Whitfield's medical empire. If you're enjoying this story of twists, turns, and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Diana was about to discover inside that mansion would turn a simple cupcake sale into the most intelligent and devastating revenge a billionaire family has ever faced. Inside the Whitfield mansion, Diana observed every detail with the trained eyes of someone who had spent years studying the habits of the corrupt medical elite. The artwork on the walls was worth more than the annual budget of 3 public hospitals she knew of. "Sit down," Richard said, gesturing to an Italian leather armchair. "Margaret can be intense when it comes to protecting our privacy." Diana accepted the towel but remained standing, dripping onto the Persian rug that cost more than a car. "Her wife is right about one thing, Mr. Whitfield. People like me don't really belong in places like this." Margaret appeared in the room, still clutching her cell phone like a weapon. "Richard, what is this person doing in our house? I've told you we don't want anything she's selling." "She needs money for her daughter's medicine," Richard explained, more to himself than to his wife. "It's a temporary situation, I'm sure." Diana almost laughed at the irony. Richard Whitfield showing compassion for a desperate mother, when his investments had denied proper medical treatment to thousands of families like her. Temporary. Margaret crossed her arms. "Look at her, Richard. I bet it's just another story he made up to get easy money. She probably doesn't even have a daughter." That was when Diana decided to test the limits of the Whitfields' cruelty. She took a crumpled photo of an 8-year-old girl, Luna, her adopted daughter, who had lost her biological parents due to medical negligence in the hospital system Richard financed, out of her wet pocket. "This is Luna," Diana said calmly. "She has leukemia. The experimental treatment that can save her costs $5,000 a month." Margaret took the photo with disdain. "How convenient. A sick child shows up at our door just when we need to feel sorry for her. Richard, you're not falling for this charade, are you?" Richard studied the photo for a few seconds. Diana watched his face, looking for any sign of humanity, but saw only the cold calculation of a man accustomed to turning suffering into profit. $5,000 a month is a lot of money," he said finally. "What kind of work did you do before you sold candy?" "I was a nurse at Metropolitan Hospital," Diana replied, knowing that this information would change everything. The silence that followed was revealing. Metropolitan was one of the hospitals involved in Richard's scheme, where Diana had worked for 2 years documenting every irregularity, every falsified document, every decision that prioritized profit over human lives. Metropolitan. Margaret smiled maliciously. So his nurse was fired for incompetence. That's the only explanation for a nurse selling candy on the street. Diana remained calm, even though she knew Margaret was intentionally provoking her. Actually, I was fired for questioning protocols that put patients at risk. Of course you were, Margaret rolled her eyes. It's always the system's fault, never the incompetent person. It was at that moment that Richard asked a question that revealed exactly who he was. Did you report these alleged irregularities to anyone? Diana looked him straight in the eye. I reported them to the board of directors, the health department, and the public prosecutor's office. 3 years of detailed reports. Richard's expression changed subtly. Only someone who knew him very well would notice the tension that settled in his shoulders. And what kind of irregularities were these, he asked, trying to sound casual. Mainly related to overcharging for procedures and denying treatments approved by insurance companies, Diana said, watching how Richard tried to maintain his composure. Poor patients being deliberately subjected to inferior treatment while costs were inflated on paper. Margaret snorted. Typical conspiracy theories from resentful employees. Richard, his dear, you shouldn't give credence to that kind of talk. But Richard was no longer listening to his wife. His eyes remained fixed on Diana, as if trying to decipher exactly how much she knew. These reports, he said slowly, did they ever lead to any official investigation? Diana smiled for the first time since she had entered the mansion. Oh yes. A very extensive federal investigation. How coincidental that you should ask. At that moment, Richard Whitfield realized that the wet woman standing in his living room was not a desperate candy saleswoman. She was something much more dangerous, someone who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Each new question from his only confirmed what Diana had suspected for years. Richard Whitfield wasn't just a distant investor, he was directly involved in the decisions that had killed innocent patients. For a moment, when Margaret began to laugh nervously at Diana's fantasy, everyone in the room thought they were witnessing just another sad story of social injustice. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that Diana wasn't there to ask for help. She was collecting the last piece of evidence she needed to completely destroy the empire built on the bones of people who trusted the American medical system. Richard rose from his chair and walked over to the panoramic window as if he needed distance to process what he had just heard. Diana watched his every move, mentally cataloging the micro-expressions that confirmed her darkest suspicions. A federal investigation, you said? Richard tried to sound casual, but Diana noticed how his hands clenched into involuntary fists. What kind of investigation? The kind that looks into discrepancies between death reports and insurance payments, Diana replied calmly. Especially when patients die after being denied treatment for administrative reasons that are later approved post-mortem to maximize reimbursements. Margaret, who had remained silent during the tense exchange, interrupted with a nervous laugh. Richard, dear, why are you giving credence to these conspiracy fantasies? Her clearly trying to impress us with crazy theories. But Richard was no longer feigning casual interest. Diana, may I ask exactly which hospitals you mentioned in these reports? It was then that Diana decided to play her first revealing card. Metropolitan, obviously. But also St. Augustine, Mercy General, and Cedar Hills. All with very similar patterns of overbilling and denial of treatment. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard knew every one of those names because they were the 4 major hospitals in her medical investment network. What an interesting coincidence, he said, his voice now laden with a thinly veiled threat. Did you work at all of those places? I didn't have to work at all of them, Diana smiled. When you document a systematic pattern, the data from one hospital reveals the irregularities at the others. Especially when the same executives move between administrations. Diana took a sealed plastic envelope from her wet pocket. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, his secretary Christina was very helpful when she called last week to confirm our meeting today. Richard paled visibly. What meeting? I never scheduled a meeting with you. Of course not. But Christina thought so when I called and identified myself as Dr. Diana Santos, a medical audit consultant hired by his law firm to review some hospital contracts. Margaret looked confused, glancing between Diana and her husband. Richard, what is she talking about? What secretary Christina? Diana continued, ignoring Margaret completely. Christina was very efficient. She emailed me copies of all the investment contracts I needed to review. 47 documents, to be exact, including those showing his active participation in decisions to approve and deny treatments. Richard realized at that moment that he had been completely deceived. The wet woman in his office was not a desperate victim. She was a predator who had spent months, perhaps years, meticulously constructing a trap. "You can't prove anything with stolen documents," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Stolen?" Diana laughed genuinely for the first time. "Richard, may I call you Richard? Everything was officially requested through your own company." Her secretary even included her personal stamp on the authorization emails. It was at that moment that Diana's phone rang. She answered with irritating nonchalance. "Hi, Marcus. Yes, I'm here at his house now." "No, he doesn't know about the other documents yet." "Okay, 20 minutes then." Margaret finally understood the gravity of the situation. "Richard, what's going on? What documents? What fraud?" But Richard was too busy calculating damages to respond to his wife. "Diana, what exactly do you want? Money? How much?" The question revealed everything Diana needed to confirm about Richard Whitfield's character. Faced with the possibility of criminal exposure, his first reaction was to try to buy silence. "Interesting," she said, jotting something down in a small notebook. Her first reaction is to offer a bribe to a federal witness. Marcus will love to hear that. "It wasn't a bribe, it was a misunderstanding," Richard tried to correct himself quickly. "Of course it was." Diana stood up, walking across the luxurious room as if she owned it. "You know Richard, I've studied him for 3 years. I've read every interview he's given, every speech about corporate social responsibility and commitment to public health. It's fascinating how he can talk about saving lives while profiting from people's deaths." Diana stopped in front of a photo on the bookshelf, Richard receiving a humanitarian award from a medical organization. "This photo is especially ironic. You received this award in the same month you denied chemotherapy treatment to 17 children at the Metropolitan." "That's a lie," Richard said, but her voice lacked conviction. "A lie." Diana opened the plastic envelope and spread photographs across the coffee table. "These are photos of the 17 children. All died between October and December last year. All had treatments initially approved and then cancelled due to administrative review." Margaret picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It was a girl of perhaps 6, smiling in a hospital bed. "Richard, tell me this isn't true." Richard looked at his wife, at the photos, at Diana, who watched everything with the calmness of someone who had planned every second of this revelation. "Margaret, you don't understand how the medical system works. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made to keep hospitals financially viable. If hospitals go bankrupt, no one gets help." Richard's response was exactly what Diana had expected, a cold rationalization that revealed her complete lack of humanity. Margaret dropped the photo as if it were burning. "You're talking about dead children, Richard. Children. Those were decisions made by the medical board, not his," Richard lied desperately. Diana opened another envelope. "In fact, I have emails here from his specifically directing which cases should be re-evaluated based on the cost of treatment versus the value of the life insurance." The sound of cars pulling up to the mansion made everyone look toward the window. 3 black vehicles parked in the driveway. "Ah," Diana said, checking her watch, "Marcus is right on time. He's very punctual when it comes to arresting criminals." Richard rushed to the window, seeing men in suits getting out of the cars with briefcases and equipment. "Diana, wait. We can talk about this. I can compensate the families, I can change hospital protocols, I can make donations to medical research." Diana looked at him with an expression that mixed pity and determination. "Richard, for 3 years you had the chance to do the right thing. Every report I sent, every complaint I made, every opportunity you had to fix the system. And what did you do? You continued to kill people in the name of profit." The doorbell rang, echoing through the mansion like a death sentence. "The only compensation these families will ever receive," Diana said, walking to answer the door, "is knowing that you will never be able to do this to anyone else." As Diana headed for the entrance hall, Margaret turned to her husband with eyes full of tears and horror. "How many people, Richard? How many people died because of you? But Richard Whitfield was no longer listening. He was frantically calculating whether he had time to destroy documents, whether he could flee the country, whether there was any way to escape the net Diana had so patiently woven around his person. What he didn't know was that Diana had recorded every word of the conversation through the device hidden in the photo envelope. And that Marcus wasn't just a federal prosecutor, he was also the father of one of the 17 children who had died at the Metropolitan. When Diana opened the door of the Whitfield mansion to let justice in, she knew that every tear she had shed, every sleepless night documenting crimes, every moment of humiliation she had suffered had been worth it. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's using his own arrogance to build the perfect trap. Marcus Chen entered the Whitfield mansion followed by 3 federal agents and a digital forensics team. His eyes met Diana's for a brief second, a silent communication between 2 people who had spent years preparing for this moment. "Attorney Chen, FBI," he said, showing his badge to Richard. "Mr. Whitfield, we have a search and seizure warrant related to investigations of medical fraud and manslaughter." Margaret let out a muffled scream. "Manslaughter? Richard, what is this about?" But Richard couldn't take his eyes off Marcus, slowly processing devastating information. You're Emily Chen's father. The girl who died at the Metropolitan. Emily was 6 years old when you personally denied her experimental treatment, Marcus said with blood-curdling calm. She died 15 days later. Remember? Diana watched Richard turn completely pale. Marcus, he just admitted direct knowledge of the cases. Everything was recorded. It was then that Richard realized the full extent of the trap. Diana wasn't just a former nurse. She was a federal investigator who had been working undercover for 3 years. The recording device wasn't hidden in the photo envelope. It was on her cell phone, which had been left on throughout the entire conversation. "You can't use recordings made without a court order," Richard said desperately. "We don't need to," Marcus replied. "You confessed voluntarily in the presence of a federal agent. Furthermore, her secretary Christina has already voluntarily provided all the documents Diana officially requested." Diana smiled for the first time since she had entered that house. "Richard, did you really think Christina was his secretary? She's been working for the FBI for 2 years. She was transferred specifically to infiltrate his company." The floor literally disappeared beneath Richard's feet. Christina had had access to every email, every document, every confidential conversation for 2 whole years. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You can't prove that I knew specifically about individual cases." Diana took a tablet out of her coat and played an audio recording. Richard's voice echoed clearly through the room. "Emily Chen, 6 years old, acute leukemia. Approved treatment would cost $200,000, but her life insurance is worth $300,000. Deny treatment. If she dies in less than 90 days, the hospital stands to make $100,000 net." "This recording is from a Metropolitan Board meeting last October," Diana explained. "Christina was present as her personal assistant." Richard tried one last desperate gambit. "Even if it's true, you'll never be able to prove that I had the authority to make those decisions. I was just an investor." Marcus opened a folder and spread contracts across the table. "In fact, according to these documents you signed, you had veto power over all treatments over $50,000. Her company controlled 43% of the hospitals in the network." Diana approached Richard, who was now visibly sweating. "You know what the most ironic part is, Richard? For 3 years, he had dozens of opportunities to do the right thing. Every report I sent, every official complaint, every chance to fix the system. And what did you do? You doubled down on cruelty." One of the federal agents approached with handcuffs. "Richard Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, manslaughter of 17 minors, and obstruction of justice." As they read his constitutional rights, Margaret looked at Diana with tears in her eyes. "How many families? How many families has he destroyed?" 143 documented deaths in the last 5 years, Diana replied softly. "All preventable. All sacrificed for profit." Richard was handcuffed in the middle of the room where he had tried to buy Diana's silence just an hour earlier. As they led him away, he shouted one last time, "You don't know who you're messing with. I have lawyers who will destroy you." Diana watched him being dragged away by federal agents. "Richard, His lawyers are being arrested right now in offices all over the city. It's a simultaneous operation. Outside, a crowd of journalists had gathered. Television cameras captured every second of the billionaire being placed in the federal vehicle. Marcus approached Diana as they watched through the window. 3 years of work. Every day was worth it. Every sleepless night, Diana agreed. Every moment pretending to be just his fired nurse. Margaret, still sitting in the armchair, looked at Diana. How did you plan all this? How did you know he would confess? Diana turned to the woman she had humiliated an hour earlier. Margaret, men like his always confess when they think they're in control. Their arrogance is the best weapon we have against them. On the television, the news was already running headlines. Medical billionaire arrested for child murder, and medical fraud scheme netted hundreds of millions. Diana picked up her now unnecessary tray of cupcakes and walked toward the door. Margaret, his mansion will probably be confiscated as proceeds of crime. But don't worry, the government has assistance programs for people who have lost everything. And this time, no amount of money would be enough to buy a way out. For 3 years, Diana Santos had pretended to be the perfect victim. Today it was revealed that she was, in fact, the most patient and intelligent predator the American healthcare system had ever faced. But would justice for 143 families be enough to heal the wounds of those who dedicate their lives to protecting those who cannot protect themselves? 6 months after Richard Whitfield's arrest, Diana Santos sat in the Attorney General's office, not as a witness, but as the new director of the Federal Medical Fraud Investigation Department. 143 families received compensation totaling $87 million, reported Marcus, now promoted to supervisor of the operation. The Whitfield scheme was even bigger than we thought. Diana looked out the window at the Washington Gardens, thinking of Luna, who was now in complete remission after receiving the treatment Richard had denied so many other children. The 8-year-old girl had not only survived, she was thriving at a private school paid for with the federal reward money Diana had received for exposing the largest medical fraud in American history. And Richard? She asked, though she already knew the answer. 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, Marcus smiled. The lawyers he bragged about having were all indicted as accomplices. 3 of them have already pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Whitfield Industries was dissolved, its assets auctioned off to pay compensation to the families. The Beverly Hills mansion where Diana had been humiliated now served as a free community health center, an irony that she had personally suggested to the judge. Margaret Whitfield, who for decades had lived off his systematic cruelty without questioning the source of his luxury, found herself completely alone. His high society friends disappeared when the scandals came to light. She now lived in a modest apartment, working as an attendant at a veterinary clinic, the only job she could get after her face became associated with the biggest corporate crime of the decade. You know what impresses me the most? Marcus said, leafing through the case files. How you kept your cool for 3 years. Documenting every crime, pretending to be just a fired nurse, enduring daily humiliation. Diana smiled, remembering the day she decided that public exposure would be more satisfying than any violence. Marcus, men like Richard Whitfield are destroyed by their own arrogance. They can't imagine that someone inferior could be smarter than him. The phone rang. It was CNN wanting an interview about the documentary Netflix was producing on the Whitfield case. Diana had become a national symbol of how a determined person can take down corporate giants using intelligence instead of force. 3 years pretending to sell cupcakes, she laughed, hanging up the phone. To discover that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's using his own arrogance to bring about her downfall. On the TV in the waiting room, a news report was airing about Richard completing his first week in federal prison. The man who once controlled the life and death of patients now wore an orange jumpsuit and worked in the prison laundry. His cellmates, upon discovering that he had caused the deaths of children for money, were not particularly welcoming. Diana picked up a photo of Luna at her second-grade graduation, the girl Richard had sentenced to death, who now dreamed of becoming a doctor to help other sick children like Diana helped her. Do you know what the best moment was? Diana asked Marcus as they organized the last documents in the case. The trial. No. It was when Margaret found me at the supermarket last month and apologized. She finally understood that every penny she spent on luxury shoes came out of the pockets of desperate families. Diana had turned 3 years of systematic humiliation into the largest anti-corruption operation in American medical history. Her patience, meticulous documentation, and ability to plan for the long term proved that the sweetest revenge is not emotional, it's strategic. The Time magazine Person of the Year award was framed on the wall, next to photos of Luna playing in the garden of the new house they bought with the federal reward money. Diana had learned that some enemies are too big to confront directly. They need to be entangled in a web so perfect that they destroy themselves trying to escape. As she prepared to leave the office, Diana thought of the 143 families who had finally received justice, the thousands of patients now receiving proper treatment thanks to reforms implemented after the Whitfield scandal, and the 8-year-old girl who woke up every morning without pain thanks to the downfall of an arrogant billionaire. Richard Whitfield had tried to buy Diana's silence with humiliation and contempt. In return, she gave him something that no amount of money could buy back: permanent consequences for every life he destroyed. The best revenge, Diana Santos discovered, is not to stoop to the level of those who hurt him. It is to rise so high that they can never reach her, while they watch from the bottom of the hole he dug for himself. If this story has inspired you to never give up on justice, even when it takes years to arrive, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes patience is the most powerful weapon extraordinary people can use against those who think power and money make them untouchable.